Okay, my name is Connor Weschenberg. My topic was a three-fifths compromise. So before I start, let me just say my thesis. The writers of the Constitution wrote the three-fifths compromise very carefully to address the issue of slavery for years to come. Alright, now I'll start, so buckle up. Okay, so now I'm going to read this red portion over here. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Okay, so this is going over how the population of each state is being counted. You can see that free citizens as well as indentured servants will count as one person towards a state's population. It also mentions that Native Americans who are not taxed do not count towards the state's population, and all other persons count as 3/5 of a person. You can see that it does not once use the word slave. Now, just in case you have no idea why the three-fifths compromise was created, here's a short explanation. So I'm going to be reading from here to here. When the Constitutional Convention debated the issue of how to count population for the purposes of representation, the Southern delegates to the convention would have been pleased if non-voting slaves had been counted as full persons. That way, the Southern states would have had a greater representation in the House of Representatives. In contrast, some Northern delegates resisted counting slaves at all. Why, asked Elbridge Gerry? The blacks, who are property in the South, be in the rule of representation more than that of the cattle and horses of the North? Among other things, counting slaves provided an incentive to import still more slaves. Okay, so because the southern states want slaves who were not able to vote be counted towards population, and northern states did not want that, the writers of the Constitution decided that if they didn't find some way to be able to please both the North and the South on this topic, they would not be able to pass the Constitution. They decided that 3 out of every 5 slaves would be counted towards the state's population. Alright, now let me just translate this part of the article. Some states felt as if it was unfair how the slaves were labeled as a fraction of a person towards a population when it came to representation, but it was not that same fraction when it came to taxing the people of that state. So they fixed that. The population based on free people to 3/5 of the slaves in that state was not only used for representation, but for taxation as well. Okay, so to finish this off, I'll show a short portion of a crash course video to give you a basic overview of what I just said, as well as some other stuff near the end.
The membership in the House would be based on the state's population, but at the time there was an issue about how to count that population. The issue was slavery, more specifically, how to count slaves as part of the state's population. Let's go to the thought bubble. The states with large slave populations like South Carolina and Virginia had a pretty big interest in counting these slaves for the purposes of determining representation. And the states with few slaves didn't want them counted at all, because this would mean that the white non-slave people in those states with lots of slaves would effectively be better represented than the white non-slave people in the states with few slaves. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention solved this problem with another compromise that was decidedly less great. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution includes the following clause. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to the respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to a service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. If you're looking for the word slave, you won't find it. They're the ones described by the phrase 3/5 of all other persons. This is the notorious 3/5 compromise. What it means is that in order to determine how many representatives a state has, you count the number of free people in the state, including indentured servants, and add to that number 3/5 of the number of non-free persons, otherwise known as slaves. So in terms of counting, each slave was worth 3/5 of each free person. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Anyway, this meant that the states with large populations of slaves would be disproportionately represented in Congress, but not quite so badly that most northern states with small numbers of slaves wouldn't vote for the Constitution. What this also did was enshrine the idea that slaves who were mostly black were worth less than free people who were mostly white, and it embedded slavery into the Constitution.
Alright, so I've already gone over the majority of what he just said, but now he's going to start talking about the challenges that appeared when they tried to pass this Constitution.
Because the Constitution was passed, we tend to think that everyone loved it, but it wasn't nearly as clear-cut as hindsight makes it appear. Eventually, the Federalists had to offer another compromise, promising a Bill of Rights in the first 10 amendments. This isn't called one of the constitutional compromises because it happened outside of the convention, but it was yet another example of how different interests had to give a little in order to get a constitution passed. It's very important to remember that compromise, the idea of balancing interests and giving a little to get a lot, is embedded in the Constitution. While today it seems like a political dirty word, compromise is the basis of the American government itself.
Okay, we're done here. Oh yeah, and these are my sources.